The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform of Cedar Creek's train depot. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore stood alone, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle of her worn carpetbag. The leather was cracked from years of use, and inside it held everything she owned in the world: a few dresses, some books, and the last of her savings. She looked down at the train ticket in her other hand. San Francisco, it read, one way. The paper felt heavy despite weighing almost nothing. This small piece of paper represented her entire future, a future she never thought she would have to face alone. Margaret was 23 years old, though the events of the past week had aged her beyond her years. She had been the school teacher in Cedar Creek for nearly 2 years, and she loved her job more than anything. The children adored her, and she had worked tirelessly to improve their education. She had even used her own money to buy supplies when the school budget ran short. But now all of that was over. Just 5 days ago, her world had crumbled. Mayor Thomas Bradley, the man she had been engaged to marry in just 2 months, had stood before the entire town council and accused her of stealing money meant for the school. The words still echoed in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Margaret Whitmore has been taking funds designated for school supplies and using them for her own purposes, he had declared, his voice cold and unfamiliar. I have evidence that she has stolen over $300 from our children's education. The room had erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Parents who had trusted her with their children looked at her with shock and disgust. Mrs. Henderson, whose daughter Lucy was Margaret's best student, had actually spat on the ground near Margaret's feet. Margaret had tried to defend herself, explaining that she had never touched the school funds except to buy legitimate supplies. She had receipts, she insisted. She had records. But when she went to retrieve them from her desk at the schoolhouse, they were gone. Every single piece of paper that could prove her innocence had vanished. Thomas had looked at her with eyes that seemed like those of a stranger. I'm sorry, Margaret, he had said, though his voice held no warmth. The evidence is clear. You leave me no choice but to ask for your resignation and to end our engagement. The ring, his grandmother's ring that she had worn so proudly for 6 months, now sat in a small box in her carpetbag. She couldn't bear to look at it, but she couldn't throw it away either. The train whistle blew in the distance, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness in her chest. Margaret adjusted her blue traveling dress and checked her hair one more time in the reflection of the depot window. She looked presentable, though her eyes were red from crying and her face was thinner than it had been a week ago. She hadn't been eating much lately. All aboard for Sacramento and San Francisco, the conductor called out as the great iron beast of a train pulled into the station. Steam hissed from its sides and the ground trembled beneath Margaret's feet. She had a cousin in San Francisco, though they hadn't spoken in years. Helen had written once to say she was doing well, working as a seamstress in the big city. Margaret hoped Helen would remember her kindly enough to help her get started. She had no other choice. As passengers began boarding the train, Margaret took one last look at Cedar Creek, the town that had been her home, the place where she had planned to spend the rest of her life. Now felt like a prison she was finally escaping. The general store where she had bought penny candy for good students. The church where she and Thomas were supposed to be married. The schoolhouse where she had spent the happiest days of her life. A tear rolled down her cheek and she quickly wiped it away. She had cried enough. It was time to be strong. Miss? The conductor asked gently. Are you boarding? Margaret nodded and stepped toward the train. Her legs felt unsteady, as if she were walking on shifting sand. This was really happening. She was really leaving everything behind. As she climbed the steps into the passenger car, she didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows beneath the depot's overhang. A man in worn leather chaps and a dusty hat watched her every movement with intense green eyes. His weathered hands were clenched into fists, and his jaw was set with determination. Jake McAllister had been at the saloon the night before when Mayor Bradley had celebrated a little too much and talked a little too freely. The things Jake had heard made his blood boil. A good woman was being destroyed by a corrupt man's lies, and nobody seemed to care about the truth. Jake knew Margaret Whitmore by sight, though they had never really spoken. He had seen her in town, always carrying books or art supplies for her students. He had watched her stop to help Mrs. Patterson's elderly mother cross the muddy street during the spring rains. He had noticed how the children's faces lit up when they saw her coming. She wasn't the type of person who would steal money from children. Jake was certain of that. Inside the train car, Margaret found an empty seat by the window and settled her bag beside her. The other passengers paid her little attention, which was a relief. She couldn't bear any more suspicious looks or whispered conversations. The train car was about half full. A businessman in a fine suit sat across the aisle reading a newspaper. An elderly woman with a basket of knitting needles sat near the front. A young mother tried to quiet her fussy baby while her husband looked out the window with tired eyes. Margaret envied them all. They looked like they knew where they were going and why. She felt lost, like a leaf blown away by a storm with no idea where she might land. The conductor walked through the car, checking tickets and helping passengers with their bags. When he reached Margaret, she handed him her ticket with a shaking hand. "San Francisco," he said with a smile. "Beautiful city. First time visiting?" "Yes," Margaret replied quietly. She didn't trust herself to say more. The train whistle blew again, longer this time. Margaret felt the car lurch slightly as the great wheels began to turn. This was it. There was no going back now. She pressed her face to the window, watching as the depot slowly moved past. A few people stood on the platform, waving goodbye to passengers. Margaret had no one to wave to. No one had come to see her off. Even her closest friend, Rebecca, had turned away from her after the accusations. The train picked up speed, and soon the buildings of Cedar Creek were growing smaller in the distance. Margaret closed her eyes and leaned back against the hard seat. She tried to imagine what San Francisco would be like. Helen had described it as exciting and full of opportunities for a woman willing to work hard. Maybe she could find work as a governess for a wealthy family. Or perhaps she could work in a shop. She had always been good with numbers and keeping records. Surely someone would need those skills. The rhythmic clicking of the train wheels on the tracks was almost soothing. For the first time in days, Margaret felt her shoulders begin to relax. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the nightmare she was leaving behind. She had no idea that her journey was about to take an unexpected turn, or that the cowboy who had been watching her was already planning to change everything. Margaret had just begun to settle into the rhythm of the train when she heard heavy footsteps coming down the aisle. The sound was different from the conductor's polished shoes or the businessman's leather boots. These were the solid, confident steps of someone who spent his days working hard under the open sky. She didn't look up at first. She was staring out the window, watching the familiar landscape of her home disappear behind rolling hills and scattered farms. Each mile that passed felt like another door closing on her old life. The footsteps stopped right beside her seat. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was deep and steady, with a slight drawl that spoke of long days under the Texas sun. Margaret's head snapped up and she found herself looking into the most intense green eyes she had ever seen. The man standing in the aisle was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-streaked brown hair that needed a trim, and a face that had been weathered by wind and sun. His clothes marked him as a working man, worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. His boots were scuffed and dusty, and his hat was in his hands, revealing that he had removed it out of respect. Margaret recognized him, though she didn't know his name. She had seen him around town occasionally, usually leading horses or loading supplies. He was one of the ranch hands from the big spread outside of town. But why was he here? And how did he know her name? "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the train's noise. "Do I know you?" "Name's Jake McAllister," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I work for the Double R Ranch, and yes, you know me, though we've never been properly introduced." Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment. She probably should have known his name. Cedar Creek wasn't a large town, and she prided herself on knowing most of the people in the community. But with everything that had happened, her mind felt scattered and unclear. "Mr. McAllister," she said carefully, "I'm not sure why you're here, but as you can see, I'm traveling to California. I'm no longer a resident of Cedar Creek." Jake's jaw tightened, and Margaret noticed that several other passengers had turned to listen to their conversation. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. The last thing she needed was more attention or more gossip. "That's exactly why I'm here," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the car. "Miss Whitmore, your journey ends with me." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at him in shock, unable to process what he had just said. Several passengers gasped, and the businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper to get a better look at the unfolding drama. "I beg your pardon?" Margaret whispered, her heart beginning to race. Jake glanced around at the curious faces watching them, then looked back at Margaret. His expression was serious but not unkind. "I know this must seem strange, ma'am, but I need you to hear me out. What happened to you back in Cedar Creek? It wasn't right. And it wasn't true." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Mr. McAllister, I don't know what you think you know, but I know Thomas Bradley is a liar and a thief," Jake said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the hushed train car. "And I know you're innocent of everything he accused you of." The businessman folded his newspaper completely and leaned forward with obvious interest. The elderly woman with her knitting had stopped working and was listening intently. Even the young mother had managed to quiet her baby and was straining to hear every word. Margaret felt like the walls of the train car were closing in on her. "Mr. McAllister, please," she said, her voice shaking. "I appreciate whatever you think you're trying to do, but I just can't go through this again." The evidence was clear. The town council voted. "It's over." "No, ma'am, it's not over," Jake said firmly. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Not by a long shot." Margaret stared at the paper in his hand as if it might bite her. "What is that?" "This," Jake said, unfolding the paper carefully, "is a letter I took from Mayor Bradley's office last night. It's correspondence between him and a man named Patterson in the territorial government. They've been working together to steal money from several towns, including ours." Margaret's vision seemed to blur around the edges. "That's impossible. Thomas would never." "Read it," Jake said gently, holding the letter out to her. With trembling hands, Margaret took the paper. The handwriting was definitely Thomas's. She would recognize it anywhere. They had exchanged letters during their courtship, and she knew every loop and curve of his pen. As her eyes scanned the words, her heart began to pound harder and harder. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before her accusations, and it clearly outlined a plan to blame the missing funds on the schoolteacher to deflect attention from the real theft. "We can pin this on the girl easily enough," Thomas had written. "She's been asking too many questions about the budget anyway. Patterson agrees that a scapegoat is necessary to keep the territorial officials from digging deeper into our arrangement." Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time. Her hands were shaking so badly that the paper rustled like leaves in a windstorm. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "I've been suspicious of Bradley for months," Jake explained, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Money that was supposed to go to ranch subsidies kept disappearing. Feed prices that the territory was supposed to help with somehow never got covered. Last night at the saloon, Bradley had too much to drink and started bragging about how clever he'd been." Jake's face hardened as he continued. "He said some things about you that no gentleman should ever say about a lady. Things that made it clear he'd been planning to ruin your reputation all along, so I decided to do some investigating of my own." Margaret stared down at the letter, feeling as if the world had tilted on its axis. Everything she had believed about the past week was wrong. Thomas hadn't been forced to choose between love and duty. He had deliberately destroyed her life to save his own skin. "But the evidence," she said weakly. "My records were missing from the schoolhouse." "I'd bet money that Bradley took them himself," Jake said. "Probably the same night he planted whatever fake evidence he used to convince the town council." The train swayed as it rounded a curve, and Margaret felt dizzy. She pressed her free hand to her forehead, trying to make sense of everything. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Jake. "Why are you telling me this? Why do you care what happens to me?" Jake was quiet for a moment, and Margaret noticed that his eyes were very kind despite their intensity. "Because I've watched you around town, Miss Whitmore. I've seen how you treat people. All people, whether they're rich or poor, important or forgotten. I saw you give your own lunch to the Patterson boy when his family was going through hard times. I watched you stay after school every day to help children who were struggling." He paused, then continued more softly. "A person who would do those things wouldn't steal money from children. And a person like that doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed by a corrupt politician." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Jake straightened up and looked her directly in the eyes. "I'm suggesting that you come back to Cedar Creek with me. I'm suggesting that we gather enough evidence to prove Bradley's guilt and clear your name. I'm suggesting that we make sure he pays for what he's done to you and to our town." Margaret looked around the train car. Every passenger was watching them with fascination. as if they were actors in a play. She realized that whatever she decided to do next, it would be witnessed by strangers who would probably tell the story for years to come. "Mr. McAllister," she said slowly, "I barely know you. Why should I trust you?" Jake smiled for the first time since he'd approached her seat. It was a warm, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Because, Miss Whitmore, I'm asking you to trust me with nothing more than the truth. And the truth is something that can't hurt you anymore." Margaret stared at Jake McAllister for what felt like an eternity. The train continued its steady rhythm down the tracks, carrying her further away from Cedar Creek with each passing moment. But now, with this cowboy standing before her holding evidence of her innocence, everything felt different. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you have proof that Thomas is guilty, why didn't you take it to the sheriff? Why come after me?" Jake shifted his weight, and Margaret noticed that several passengers were still watching their conversation with obvious interest. The businessman across the aisle had given up all pretense of reading his newspaper and was listening openly. "Because Sheriff Williams is Thomas Bradley's cousin," Jake said quietly, "and because half the town council members have been getting kickbacks from Bradley's schemes. The corruption goes deeper than just one man, Miss Whitmore." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had known Sheriff Williams since she was a child. He had always seemed like an honest man, someone she could trust. The idea that he might be involved in Thomas's crimes made her feel sick. "I need some air," she said suddenly, standing up so quickly that she swayed slightly. "I can't. This is too much." Jake immediately stepped back to give her room. "Of course. But Miss Whitmore, we're going to reach the next station in about 20 minutes. If you're going to change your mind about going to California, that's your last chance." Margaret pushed past him into the aisle, her carpet bag clutched tightly in her hand. She made her way to the back of the car, where there was a small platform that allowed passengers to step outside for fresh air. Jake followed at a respectful distance. The wind whipped through Margaret's hair as she stood on the platform, watching the Texas countryside roll by. Rolling hills covered in wildflowers stretched as far as the eye could see. This was her home, the land where she had grown up and where she had planned to spend her entire life. Was she really ready to abandon it based on the word of a man she barely knew? "Miss Whitmore?" Jake's voice was gentle as he joined her on the platform. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand something. If you go to California and I try to expose Bradley on my own, he'll find a way to discredit me. People will say I'm just a cowboy with a grudge. But if you're there, with your education and your reputation in the community—" "What reputation?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Mr. McAllister, my reputation is in ruins. Half the town thinks I'm a thief and the other half thinks I'm a fallen woman who was caught stealing by her own fiancé. That's exactly why we need to clear your name," Jake said firmly. "Because you don't deserve any of this." Margaret turned to look at him. His green eyes were serious and determined, but she could also see something else there, a genuine concern that surprised her. She had spent the last week feeling like she was completely alone in the world, and here was this stranger offering to help her fight back. "Why?" she asked. "Really, Mr. McAllister, why would you risk yourself for someone you don't even know?" Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out at the passing landscape. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My father was cheated out of his ranch by a corrupt banker when I was 15 years old. The man had been stealing from dozens of families, but he was smart enough to cover his tracks and powerful enough that nobody wanted to challenge him." He paused, his hands gripping the platform railing. "My father died believing that he had failed his family, that he wasn't smart enough or strong enough to protect what was ours. He never knew that the banker eventually got caught and went to prison. He died thinking he was a failure when really he was just another victim." Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I'm sorry. The point is," Jake continued, "I swore I would never stand by and watch an innocent person get destroyed by someone with power and no conscience. I may just be a ranch hand, but I know right from wrong. And what Thomas Bradley did to you is wrong." The train began to slow down, and Margaret could see buildings in the distance. They were approaching the next station. In just a few minutes, she would have to make a decision that would change the course of her entire life. "Even if I believed you," she said slowly, "even if I agreed to come back with you, what makes you think we could actually prove anything? Thomas is smart and he's been planning this for months. He's covered his tracks." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. "This is why I think we have a chance." Margaret looked at the paper. It appeared to be a receipt of some kind, but the writing was faded and difficult to read. "What is it?" "It's a receipt from a printing shop in Austin," Jake explained. Bradley paid to have fake invoices made up. Invoices that he used to justify withdrawing money from the school fund. But he made a mistake. The printer kept a record of the job, including what was printed. Margaret's eyes widened. "How did you get this?" "I have friends in Austin," Jake said simply. "I sent a telegram yesterday asking them to do some checking. This came back on the morning train." Margaret studied the receipt more carefully. The date was from 3 months ago, long before any of the missing money had been reported. If this was real, it proved that Thomas had been planning to frame her for months. "There's more," Jake said. "The printer remembers Bradley specifically because he paid extra to have the invoices look old and worn, as if they had been sitting in files for a long time." The train came to a complete stop, and Margaret could hear the conductor calling out the name of the station. Passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark or stretch their legs. "Miss Whitmore," Jake said urgently, "I know you have every reason not to trust me. I know this seems impossible, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to help you get your life back." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. Jake McAllister wasn't a polished gentleman like Thomas. His hands were calloused from hard work, his clothes were practical rather than fashionable, and his manner was direct rather than charming. But there was something solid about him, something honest that she found herself wanting to believe in. "If I go back with you," she said carefully, "where would I stay? I can't go back to my boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher made it very clear that I'm not welcome there anymore." "You can stay at my cabin," Jake said, then quickly added, "It's small, but it's clean and safe. And it's far enough outside of town that nobody will bother you while we're working on gathering evidence." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Mr. McAllister, surely you realize how that would look? An unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's cabin?" Jake's face reddened slightly. I suppose I could sleep in the barn. The cabin would be yours." Despite everything, Margaret found herself almost smiling. There was something endearing about his awkward gallantry. "And what about my job? Even if we prove that Thomas is guilty, the school board has already accepted my resignation." "One step at a time," Jake said. "First we clear your name, then we worry about the rest." The conductor walked by calling, "All aboard." Margaret could feel the train preparing to move again. She had to decide now. She thought about her cousin Helen in San Francisco, about starting over in a city where nobody knew her. It would be safe, anonymous. She could disappear into the crowd and build a new life from nothing. But she also thought about her students, little Lucy Patterson, who struggled with reading until Margaret found just the right books to capture her interest. Tommy Rodriguez, who had a gift for mathematics that nobody had bothered to nurture until Margaret came along. All the children who had trusted her, who had learned to love learning because she had made it exciting for them. Did she really want to let Thomas Bradley win? Did she want to run away and let him continue stealing from the community while everyone believed she was the criminal? "Mr. McAllister," she said finally, "if I agree to this, I want to be clear about something. I'm not some helpless woman who needs to be rescued. If we're going to work together, we work as equals. I may be a school teacher, but I'm not naive about how the world works." Jake nodded seriously. "Yes, ma'am. I wouldn't have it any other way. And if at any point I feel like this plan is putting me in more danger than I'm already in, I reserve the right to leave again." Understood. Margaret took a deep breath. She was about to make either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish. "All right, Mr. McAllister, let's go catch a train back to Cedar Creek." The return journey to Cedar Creek felt completely different from Margaret's desperate flight just hours earlier. Now she sat beside Jake McAllister in the cramped train car, watching familiar landmarks appear in reverse order as they retraced her path home. The rolling hills that had looked like a farewell now seemed like a welcome. But as the train drew closer to Cedar Creek, Margaret's nervousness grew. What if someone saw her getting off the train? What if word got back to Thomas that she had returned? She pulled her shawl up around her face and kept her head down as they approached the depot. "Don't worry," Jake said quietly, noticing her discomfort. "I brought my wagon. We can get you out of town quickly and quietly." When the train finally stopped, Jake helped Margaret down from the car and quickly led her around to the back of the depot where his wagon waited. It wasn't much to look at, an old farm wagon pulled by two sturdy horses, but it represented freedom and hope in a way that Margaret never could have imagined. As they drove through the outskirts of Cedar Creek, Margaret kept her head down and prayed that nobody would recognize her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, and she could see people going about their daily business as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything was different now. Jake's cabin was about 3 miles outside of town, nestled in a grove of oak trees near a small creek. It was modest but well-maintained, with a vegetable garden and a small barn where Jake kept his horses. As they pulled up to the front door, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. "It's not much," Jake said apologetically as he helped her down from the wagon. "But it's private." "It's perfect," Margaret said, and she meant it. After days of feeling like she was living in a fishbowl, with everyone watching and whispering about her, the quiet isolation of Jake's property felt like a blessing. Jake carried her carpet bag inside and showed her around the small cabin. There was a main room with a fireplace and a simple kitchen, one bedroom and a loft area where Jake usually slept. Everything was clean and organized, though clearly the home of a working man. "I'll take my things up to the barn," Jake said, gathering up some clothes and personal items. "You can have the cabin to yourself." "Mr. McAllister," Margaret said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate this." "I know you're taking a big risk by helping me." Jake paused in his packing. "Miss Whitmore, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you agree to come back with me, really? You could have had a fresh start in California." Margaret sat down in the cabin's single chair and considered the question. "Because you were right about one thing. I don't want Thomas Bradley to win. I don't want him to profit from destroying my life while I run away and hide." She paused, then continued. "And because I realized that even if I started over somewhere else, I would always wonder if I could have fought back. I would always regret not trying." Jake nodded approvingly. "That takes real courage, ma'am. Or real stubbornness," Margaret said with a slight smile. "My mother always said those two things were hard to tell apart." After Jake moved his belongings to the barn, they spent the evening planning their investigation. Margaret's sharp mind and attention to detail proved to be invaluable as they went through the evidence Jake had already gathered. "The key is going to be proving that Thomas created those fake invoices," Margaret said, studying the receipt from the Austin printer. "But we need more than just this. We need to show a pattern of theft that goes back months. I've been keeping track of the missing ranch subsidies," Jake said, pulling out a notebook filled with his careful handwriting. "Every month for the past 6 months, money that was supposed to come to the Double R has either been delayed or reduced. Boss has been wondering if we should look for work elsewhere." Margaret examined Jake's records, impressed by how thorough he had been. "You're very organized for a cowboy," she said. "My mother was a school teacher," Jake replied. "She made sure I could read and write and figure numbers before she passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said gently. "It was a long time ago. But she would have liked you, I think. She always said that education was the most important thing a person could have." Over the next few days, Jake and Margaret worked together to build their case against Thomas Bradley. Margaret used her knowledge of the school's financial records to identify exactly which transactions were legitimate and which were fraudulent. Jake used his connections throughout the county to gather information about other suspicious activities. What they discovered was worse than either of them had imagined. "Look at this," Margaret said on their third day of investigation. She had spread papers across Jake's kitchen table, creating a timeline of Thomas's crimes. "It's not just the school funds and the ranch subsidies. He's been stealing from the church building fund, the money set aside for road repairs, even the widow's relief fund." Jake studied the documents with growing anger. "That son of a—" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this makes me sick. Mrs. Patterson has been waiting for months for help fixing her roof because she thought the relief fund was empty." "How much do you think he's stolen altogether?" Margaret asked. Jake did some quick calculations. "Based on what we've found so far, at least $2,000. Maybe more." Margaret felt dizzy. $2,000 was more money than most people in Cedar Creek saw in 2 years. Thomas had been systematically robbing the entire community while presenting himself as their dedicated public servant. "We need to get into his office," she said suddenly. "There have to be more records there, more evidence of what he's been doing." Jake looked at her with concern. "Miss Whitmore, that's breaking and entering. If we get caught, we'll be in the same position we're in now," Margaret said firmly. "But if we don't get concrete proof, Thomas will just deny everything and claim that we forged these documents. Jake was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right, but we have to be smart about it. Thomas usually works late on Friday nights preparing for the weekend town council meetings. That might be our best chance. Friday evening arrived cloudy and moonless, which was perfect for their purposes. Margaret dressed in her darkest clothes and tied her hair back severely. She had never imagined that she would be sneaking around in the shadows like a criminal, but the irony wasn't lost on her that she was now actually planning to break the law in order to prove her innocence of crimes she hadn't committed. Jake met her at the edge of town, and together they made their way carefully through the back streets toward the town hall. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard that she was sure everyone in Cedar Creek could hear it. There's a light in his office, Jake whispered as they approached the building. Sure enough, a warm yellow glow was visible through the windows of Thomas's office on the second floor. They could see his silhouette moving around inside. What do we do now? Margaret whispered back. We wait, Jake said. He'll have to leave eventually. They hid behind a large oak tree across the street from the town hall and settled in to watch. Margaret had never realized how many sounds there were in a supposedly quiet town at night. Dogs barking in the distance, the creak of wooden buildings settling, the rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the light in Thomas's office went out. A few minutes later, they saw him emerge from the front door of the building. He looked around carefully before walking toward his house on the other side of town. Now, Jake said quietly. They made their way to the back of the town hall, where Jake had identified a window that didn't latch properly. With some careful manipulation, he was able to get it open wide enough for them to climb through. Inside the building, everything was dark and eerily quiet. Margaret had been in the town hall many times for meetings and community events, but it felt completely different in the darkness. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every creak of the old building made her jump. They made their way carefully up the stairs to the second floor, where Thomas's office was located. Jake had brought a small lantern, but they didn't dare light it until they were inside the office with the door closed and the windows covered. Once they had some light, Margaret gasped at what she saw. Thomas's office was filled with papers, ledgers, and files. It looked like he had been working frantically on something. Look at this, Jake said, picking up a stack of papers from Thomas's desk. Margaret examined the documents and felt her blood run cold. They were transfer orders, authorizing the movement of large sums of money from various town accounts to a private bank account in Austin. He's planning to run, she said. Look at the dates on these transfers. They're all scheduled for next week. Jake found more papers that confirmed Margaret's suspicions. Thomas had been preparing to disappear with all the money he had stolen, leaving Cedar Creek and its people to deal with the aftermath. We need to take as much of this as we can carry, Margaret said, gathering up armfuls of incriminating documents. But as they were preparing to leave, they heard something that made their blood freeze, footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming. Margaret and Jake froze as the footsteps grew louder on the stairs. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. Jake immediately blew out their small lantern, plunging them into complete darkness. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, and Margaret held her breath. She could hear Jake moving quietly beside her, and she felt his hand gently touch her arm, guiding her toward what she hoped was a hiding place. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away down the hall toward another office. Margaret and Jake waited in tense silence until they heard a door close at the far end of the building. Night watchman, Jake whispered so quietly that Margaret could barely hear him. We need to get out of here now. Moving as silently as possible, they gathered up the most important documents they had found and made their way back to the window they had entered through. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the papers she was carrying. Once they were safely outside and several blocks away from the town hall, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. That was terrifying, she said, still whispering even though they were alone. But we got what we needed, Jake said, holding up a thick stack of papers. This is enough evidence to hang Thomas Bradley, legally speaking. They made their way back to Jake's cabin in tense silence, both of them jumping at every shadow and sound. It wasn't until they were safely inside with the door locked and the curtains drawn that Margaret allowed herself to truly relax. I can't believe we just did that, she said, sinking into Jake's kitchen chair. 2 weeks ago, the most dangerous thing I had ever done was climb a ladder to hang decorations in my classroom. Jake lit a lamp and began spreading the stolen documents across his kitchen table. 2 weeks ago, I thought the most corrupt person in Cedar Creek was Old Pete, who waters down the milky cells. Despite everything, Margaret found herself laughing. It felt good to laugh again, even if the situation was far from funny. As they worked through the night examining their evidence, Margaret began to see Jake McAllister in a new light. She had initially thought of him as a simple cowboy, who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But as they worked together, she realized that he was far more complex than she had given him credit for. "You have very neat handwriting," she observed as Jake made notes about the documents they were reviewing. "My mother insisted on it," Jake said without looking up. "She said a man's character could be judged by how he wrote his letters." "What else did your mother teach you?" Jake smiled slightly. "She taught me to read everything I could get my hands on. Said that books were the best way to travel the world when you couldn't afford to leave home." Margaret looked around the cabin and noticed for the first time that Jake had quite a collection of books on a shelf near his bed. She could see volumes of poetry, history, and what looked like scientific journals about farming techniques. "You read poetry?" she asked, surprised. Jake's face reddened slightly. "Sometimes, when the day's work is done and I can't sleep." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Thomas had always dismissed poetry as frivolous nonsense, claiming that practical men had no time for such foolishness. The idea that this rugged cowboy spent his evenings reading verse was oddly touching. "What's your favorite poem?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, then recited softly, "I have miles to go before I sleep and promises to keep." "Robert Frost," Margaret said with delight. "I teach that poem to my older students." "It always seemed appropriate for ranch life," Jake said. "There's always more work to be done, always promises to keep." They worked until dawn, organizing the evidence they had gathered and planning their next moves. Margaret found herself impressed by Jake's methodical approach and his attention to detail. He might not have formal education, but he was clearly intelligent and thoughtful. When the sun began to rise, Jake insisted on making breakfast for both of them. Margaret protested that she could cook for herself, but Jake waved away her objections. "My mother also taught me that a gentleman always takes care of his guests," he said, starting a fire in the kitchen stove. As Jake cooked eggs and bacon, Margaret found herself studying his movements. He worked with the same quiet efficiency that he brought to everything else, and she noticed that his hands, though calloused from ranch work, were surprisingly gentle. "Mr. McAllister," she said as they ate breakfast, "can I ask you something personal?" "Jake," he corrected. "After everything we've been through together, I think we can use first names." "Jake, then. Have you ever wanted to do anything besides ranch work?" Jake set down his fork and considered the question. "Actually, yes. I've been saving money for years, hoping to buy my own land someday. I want to try some of the new farming techniques I've been reading about, crop rotation, soil conservation, that sort of thing." Margaret leaned forward with interest. "That sounds fascinating. Where would you want to establish your ranch?" "There's a piece of land about 20 miles north of here," Jake said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "It has good water, fertile soil, and it's big enough to try different approaches to farming and ranching. The owner wants to sell, but the price is more than I can afford right now." "How much more do you need?" Jake looked embarrassed. "About $300. It might as well be $3,000 for all the chance I have of raising that much money on a ranch hand's wages." Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. $300 was exactly the amount that Thomas had initially accused her of stealing from the school fund. "Jake," she said slowly, "what if we could not only clear my name but also recover some of the money that Thomas stole? Do you think the town would offer a reward for that kind of service?" Jake's eyebrows rose. "I hadn't thought about that." "I suppose they might." "And what if," Margaret continued, "once this is all over and I get my teaching position back, I were to apply for a grant from the Territorial Education Fund to start an experimental school? One that teaches not just traditional subjects but also modern farming techniques and practical skills." Jake stared at her. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we both have dreams that seem impossible on our own, but might be achievable if we work together." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret wondered if she had overstepped. They had known each other for less than a week, and here she was talking about long-term plans as if they were old friends. "Margaret," Jake said finally, using her first name for the first time, "I think that might be the most wonderful idea I've ever heard." Margaret felt a warm glow spread through her chest. When Jake said her name, it sounded different than when Thomas had said it. Thomas had always made her name sound like a possession, something that belonged to him. When Jake said it, it sounded like music. "Of course, first we have to survive proving Thomas's guilt," she said, trying to bring herself back to reality. "We will," Jake said with quiet confidence. "We make a good team." Over the next few days, as they continued to gather evidence and plan their strategy, Margaret found herself looking forward to their conversations. Jake had traveled more than she had expected, working on different ranches throughout Texas and even spending a winter in Colorado. His stories of life on the frontier were far more interesting than any of the society gossip that had filled her conversations with Thomas. "Have you ever seen snow?" Jake asked one evening as they sat on his front porch taking a break from their investigation. "Never," Margaret admitted. "I've read about it, of course, but I can't imagine what it would be like." "It's magical," Jake said, his voice soft with memory. "Everything becomes quiet and clean and perfect. The whole world looks like it's been covered in white silk." Margaret tried to imagine it, but it was difficult to picture something so foreign to her Texas experience. "I'd like to see it someday," she said. "Maybe you will," Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made Margaret look at him more closely. In the lamplight from the cabin windows, Jake's profile looked strong and thoughtful. Margaret realized that somewhere during their shared adventures, she had stopped thinking of him as just the cowboy who had rescued her. He had become simply Jake, intelligent, kind, funny, and surprisingly well-read. More troubling, she had also realized that she looked forward to seeing him each morning more than she had ever looked forward to seeing Thomas. "Margaret," Jake said suddenly, "can I ask you something about your engagement to Bradley?" Margaret's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "Were you happy?" "Really happy, I mean." Margaret considered the question carefully. A week ago, she would have automatically said yes. She had been engaged to the most eligible man in town, and everyone had told her how lucky she was. "I thought I was," she said honestly. "Thomas was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. He was educated, successful, respected in the community. But were you happy?" Jake pressed gently. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I was content. I felt secure. I felt like I was doing what was expected of me." "That's not the same thing as happy." "No," Margaret said softly. "I suppose it's not." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and the gentle sound of the creek running nearby. Margaret found herself thinking about the difference between security and happiness. Margaret woke to the sound of urgent knocking on Jake's cabin door. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the curtains, and for a moment she was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then reality came flooding back. She was at Jake's cabin. They had evidence against Thomas Bradley, and someone was pounding on the door as if the world was ending. She quickly threw on her robe and hurried to the window. Jake was already approaching the cabin from the barn, his face grim and alert. Behind him, Margaret could see a small dust cloud on the horizon, suggesting that their visitor had ridden hard to get here. The man at the door was Billy Peterson, a young ranch hand from a neighboring property. Margaret knew him slightly. He sometimes brought messages between the ranches, and she had taught his younger sister for a few months before the girl's family moved away. "Jake," Billy called out, his voice cracking with urgency. "You need to get out of here now." Jake reached the cabin and immediately tensed. "What's going on, Billy?" "Sheriff Williams is coming with a posse," Billy said, breathing hard. "They've got a warrant for your arrest. Something about stolen cattle from the Morrison Ranch." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. She opened the cabin door and stepped outside, not caring that she was still in her nightclothes. "Stolen cattle?" she said. "That's impossible. Jake has been here with me every night." Billy looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting to see the disgraced schoolteacher at Jake's cabin, but he quickly refocused on the urgent situation. "Ma'am, I don't know the details, but Morrison's been missing cattle for weeks. Yesterday, someone found evidence pointing to Jake. Morrison rode straight to town and got the sheriff involved." Jake's face had gone pale. "What kind of evidence?" "Some kind of papers with your name on them. and a witness who says he saw you driving Morrison's cattle toward your property at night." Margaret and Jake exchanged a look that spoke volumes. This was too convenient, too perfectly timed. They had been getting close to exposing Thomas Bradley, and suddenly Jake was being framed for a completely different crime. "Who's the witness?" Jake asked. Billy shifted uncomfortably. "Pete Hawkins." Jake cursed under his breath. Pete Hawkins was the town drunk, a man who would say anything for a bottle of whiskey and enough money to buy another. "Billy," Margaret said urgently, "how much time do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Billy said. "I rode as hard as I could when I heard what was happening. The sheriff's posse is moving slow because they've got a wagon with them." Margaret's mind raced. If Jake was arrested, especially on charges of cattle rustling, he could face years in prison or worse. And without Jake's help, she would never be able to prove her own innocence or expose Thomas's crimes. "You have to run," she said to Jake. "Get as far away from here as you can." "I'm not leaving you," Jake said firmly. "If I run, it just makes me look guilty, and it leaves you here to face Bradley alone." "Jake, if they arrest you, if they arrest me, you take the evidence we've gathered, and you find someone trustworthy to help you." Jake interrupted. "Judge Morrison in Austin is honest. He's the one who helped my friend investigate that printing shop. Telegraph him if you have to." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. After everything they had been through together, after all the plans they had made, it was going to end like this. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Jake moved toward the cabin. "Help me gather up all our evidence. If I'm going to jail, at least you'll have everything you need to finish what we started." As they rushed to collect the papers and documents they had accumulated, Margaret tried to think of alternatives. Could they both run? Could they somehow prove Jake's innocence of the cattle rustling charges? "Margaret," Jake said as he stuffed papers into a saddlebag, "there's something I need to tell you before they get here." "What?" Jake stopped what he was doing and looked directly at her. "These past few days, working with you, getting to know you, it's been the best time of my life." Margaret felt her heart clench. "Jake, don't talk like this is goodbye. I need you to know," Jake continued, "that whatever happens next, I don't regret helping you. And I don't regret caring about you." Before Margaret could respond, they heard the thunder of approaching horses. Through the window, they could see a group of riders approaching the cabin. Sheriff Williams, several deputies, and Morrison himself. "Hide the evidence," Jake said urgently, shoving the saddlebag into Margaret's hands. "Don't let them find it no matter what." Margaret quickly carried the bag to Jake's bedroom and shoved it under the bed, then covered it with a quilt that had fallen to the floor. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely manage the simple task. When she emerged from the bedroom, Jake was standing calmly by the front door, his hands visible and his expression resigned but dignified. "Jake McAllister," Sheriff Williams called from outside. "Come out with your hands up." Jake squeezed Margaret's hand briefly, then opened the door and stepped outside. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. Sheriff Williams was a large man in his 50s with graying hair and a mustache that had once been impressive, but now just looked unkempt. He sat his horse with the authority of someone who had been in law enforcement for many years. But Margaret could see something in his eyes that made her stomach turn, a guilty knowledge that told her Billy had been right about this being a setup. "Jake McAllister," the sheriff said officially. "You're under arrest for the theft of livestock belonging to Robert Morrison." Morrison himself rode forward. He was a lean, weathered man whom Margaret had always thought of as honest and fair, but now his face was hard with anger. "Found evidence in your own handwriting, McAllister," Morrison said. "Bills of sale with forged signatures trying to sell my cattle in Austin." "Mr. Morrison," Jake said calmly, "I've never stolen anything in my life, and you know it. Someone is setting me up." "The evidence says otherwise," Sheriff Williams said, dismounting from his horse. "You'll have a chance to tell your side of the story to a judge." As the sheriff moved to put handcuffs on Jake, Margaret stepped forward. "Sheriff Williams," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "surely you're not going to take the word of Pete Hawkins as evidence of anything." "Everyone in town knows he's not reliable." The sheriff looked at her with obvious disapproval. "Miss Whitmore, I'm surprised to find you here given your own legal troubles." "My legal troubles are exactly why I know how easy it is for innocent people to be framed," Margaret said boldly. "Jake McAllister is being set up just like I was." "That's enough," the sheriff said sharply. Miss Whitmore, I suggest you distance yourself from this situation before you make things worse for yourself. As the sheriff cuffed Jake's hands behind his back, Margaret felt a wave of helpless fury wash over her. She could see the satisfied look on Sheriff Williams's face, and she knew without a doubt that he was part of Thomas Bradley's network of corruption. Jake, she said as the deputies began to lead him toward their wagon. I'll find a way to fix this. Jake looked back at her with a mixture of love and desperation. Be careful, Margaret. Don't trust anyone in town. As the posse rode away with Jake in their custody, Margaret stood alone in front of the cabin watching until they disappeared over the hills. Billy Peterson, who had stayed behind, approached her cautiously. Miss Whitmore, he said quietly. I'm real sorry this happened. Jake's a good man. Yes, he is, Margaret said, her voice heavy with determination. And I'm going to prove it. After Billy left, Margaret went back into the cabin and retrieved the saddlebag full of evidence. She spread the papers across Jake's kitchen table and stared at them, trying to figure out her next move. She was now completely alone, facing a corrupt sheriff, a crooked mayor, and a town that already believed her to be a criminal. Jake was in jail, probably facing a trial that would be rigged against him from the start. But Margaret had something that Thomas Bradley and his accomplices didn't expect. She had the truth. She had evidence, and she had a growing determination to see justice done. She also had something else that surprised her with its intensity. She was deeply, completely in love with Jake McAllister, and she would move heaven and earth to save him, just as he had risked everything to save her. Margaret gathered up the most important documents and tucked them into her traveling bag. She couldn't stay at the cabin. It was too isolated, and if something happened to her here, no one would know. It was time to go back to Cedar Creek and finish what they had started, alone if necessary. As she hitched up Jake's wagon to return to town, Margaret made herself a promise. Thomas Bradley had destroyed her life once, but he wouldn't destroy Jake's. She would expose his crimes, clear both their names, and find a way to get Jake out of jail. And then, if Jake was willing, she would spend the rest of her life making sure he knew how much his courage and kindness had meant to her. The fight was far from over. Margaret drove Jake's wagon back toward Cedar Creek with her heart hammering against her ribs and her mind racing through possibilities. She couldn't go to the sheriff. He was clearly part of Thomas's corruption. She couldn't trust the town council. Jake had said that half of them were taking kickbacks, but she had to find someone, anyone, who would listen to the truth. As she approached the outskirts of town, Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of trying to sneak around and hide, she drove the wagon straight down Main Street in broad daylight. People stopped to stare as she passed, the disgraced schoolteacher who had supposedly fled town in shame, now returning bold as brass. Let them stare, Margaret thought. Let them whisper. She was done hiding. Her first stop was the post office, where she sent a telegram to Judge Morrison in Austin, just as Jake had suggested. The message was simple but urgent. Have evidence of major corruption in Cedar Creek. Need honest legal help immediately. Margaret Whitmore. From the post office, she drove to the Double R Ranch where Jake worked. She needed to speak with his boss, Robert Thompson, who Jake had mentioned was also being hurt by Thomas's theft of ranch subsidies. The Double R was one of the larger spreads in the area, with a substantial ranch house and well-maintained outbuildings. Margaret had never been there before, but she had heard that Thompson was a fair man who treated his workers well. She found Thompson near the horse corrals, talking with several of his ranch hands. He was a big man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent working outdoors. When he saw Margaret approaching, his expression was cautious but not unkind. Miss Whitmore, he said, touching his hat politely. I heard you'd left town. I came back, Mr. Thompson, Margaret said, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could manage. I need to speak with you about Jake McAllister. Thompson's face darkened. I heard about his arrest this morning. Can't say I believe those charges, but the evidence seems pretty clear. The evidence was planted, Margaret said firmly, just like the evidence that was used against me. Mr. Thompson, Jake and I have been investigating Mayor Bradley's criminal activities. We have proof that he's been stealing money from the town, including the ranch subsidies that should have been coming to you. Thompson studied her face carefully. That's a serious accusation, miss. I have serious proof, Margaret said, patting the bag that contained their evidence. Mr. Thompson, Jake told me that you've been losing money because subsidies haven't been coming through. What if I could prove that Thomas Bradley has been stealing that money for months? Thompson was quiet for a moment, then gestured toward his ranch house. Why don't you come inside and tell me what you know? Over the next hour, Margaret laid out everything she and Jake had discovered. She showed Thompson the forged invoices, the transfer orders, the correspondence with Patterson and the territorial government. Thompson's expression grew grimmer with each piece of evidence. This explains a lot, he said finally. I've been wondering why our subsidies kept getting delayed or reduced. Bradley always had some explanation about problems with the territorial bureaucracy. Mr. Thompson, Margaret said, I need your help. Jake is innocent of those cattle-rustling charges, and I believe I can prove it. But I can't do it alone. What do you need? I need someone that people in this community respect to stand with me when I present this evidence. And I need help getting Jake out of jail before Thomas decides that Jake is too dangerous to be left alive. Thompson's eyebrows rose. You think Bradley would go that far? Mr. Thompson, we're talking about thousands of dollars in stolen money. If Jake and I succeed in exposing Thomas, he'll face years in prison and complete ruin. How far do you think a desperate man might go to protect himself? Thompson stood up and began pacing around his parlor. You're right, of course. If Bradley is as corrupt as you say, then Jake's life is definitely in danger. Will you help me? Thompson stopped pacing and looked directly at Margaret. Miss Whitmore, if you're wrong about this, if you're lying or confused, then you're asking me to destroy the reputation of an elected official based on the word of a woman who's already been accused of theft. Margaret met his gaze steadily. Mr. Thompson, if I'm lying, then you can turn me over to the sheriff yourself. But if I'm telling the truth, then an innocent man is sitting in jail while a criminal plans to escape with money stolen from this entire community. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, then nodded decisively. All right, Miss Whitmore. I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. Bradley has too many allies in town for a direct confrontation to work. Over the next few hours, Margaret and Thompson developed a plan. The town council was meeting the next evening for their regular monthly session. It would be the perfect opportunity to present their evidence publicly, where Thomas couldn't suppress it or make it disappear. The key, Thompson said, is to get enough council members on our side before the meeting starts. There are a few honest men on that council, and if we can convince them privately first, they'll support us when we make our accusations public. Margaret spent the rest of the day visiting the homes of the 3 council members that Thompson identified as potentially trustworthy. It was nerve-wracking work. She never knew if she was about to speak to an honest man or one of Thomas's accomplices. The first council member, Dr. Patterson, listened to her evidence with growing amazement. My God, he said after reviewing the documents, I knew Thomas was ambitious, but I never imagined he was capable of this level of theft. The second council member, Merchant Henry Walsh, was more skeptical. But when Margaret showed him proof that Thomas had been skimming money from the road repair fund, money that Walsh had personally donated, his skepticism turned to anger. That son of a gun, Walsh muttered. I gave $50 of my own money to fix the road in front of my store, and it never got repaired. Thomas told me there were delays with the contractors. The third council member, Farmer John Martinez, didn't need much convincing. He had already been suspicious of Thomas's financial management and was eager to see proof of wrongdoing. This explains why the irrigation project never got started, Martinez said grimly. We voted to allocate funds for it 6 months ago, but Thomas kept saying there were complications. By evening, Margaret had 3 council members committed to supporting her at the next day's meeting. Thompson had also reached out to other influential members of the community, building a coalition of people who had been hurt by Thomas's thefts. But as Margaret settled in for the night at the town's small hotel, the only place she could find to stay, since Mrs. Fletcher still refused to rent to her, she realized that Thomas wasn't going to wait quietly for his exposure. Around midnight, she heard voices outside her hotel room window. Peering carefully through the curtains, she saw 2 men talking in low, urgent tones. One of them was Pete Hawkins, the supposed witness against Jake. The other was a man she didn't recognize, but his expensive clothes and confident manner suggested he wasn't a local. Has to look like an accident, she heard Pete saying. Can't be anything that points back to us. Don't worry about that, the stranger replied. I've handled situations like this before. The school teacher will have a tragic accident and your cowboy friend will have a convenient accident in jail. Problem solved. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Thomas was planning to have both her and Jake killed before they could testify. She quickly gathered her belongings and slipped out of the hotel through a back window. She couldn't stay there, it was too dangerous. But she also couldn't run away. The town council meeting was tomorrow night, and it might be her only chance to save Jake and expose Thomas's crimes. Margaret made her way carefully through the dark streets to Dr. Patterson's house. If she was going to survive until tomorrow night, she needed help from someone she could trust. Dr. Patterson answered his door in his nightclothes, alarmed to find Margaret on his doorstep at such an hour. "Miss Whitmore, what's wrong?" "Dr. Patterson," Margaret said urgently, "I think Thomas Bradley is planning to have me killed before tomorrow's council meeting." Patterson's eyes widened. "Come inside, quickly." As Margaret explained what she had overheard, Dr. Patterson's expression grew increasingly grim. "We need to contact the territorial marshal," he said. "This has gone beyond local corruption. We're talking about conspiracy to commit murder." "How long would it take for a marshal to get here?" Margaret asked. "At least 3 days. Jake might not have 3 days." Margaret said desperately, "If they're planning to kill me, they're probably planning to kill him too. We have to proceed with tomorrow's meeting as planned." Dr. Patterson was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. But we need to take precautions. I'm going to contact Thompson and the other council members tonight. We'll make sure you're protected tomorrow." As Margaret finally settled in to try to get some sleep in Dr. Patterson's guest room, she thought about Jake sitting alone in a jail cell, probably unaware of the danger he was in. She had to save him. She had come too far and risked too much to let Thomas Bradley win now. Tomorrow night would determine everything: justice or corruption, truth or lies, life or death. The morning of the town council meeting dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was holding its breath for what was to come. Margaret woke at Dr. Patterson's house feeling nervous but determined. Today would either vindicate her and Jake, or it would be the end of everything. Dr. Patterson had already left early to make final preparations with Thompson and the other council members who were supporting Margaret. She spent the morning reviewing her evidence one last time, making sure every document was in order and every fact was clear in her mind. Around noon, Thompson arrived at Dr. Patterson's house with news that made Margaret's heart race. "I went to check on Jake at the jail," he said grimly. "Sheriff Williams claims that Jake tried to escape last night and had to be restrained. Jake has a black eye and bruised ribs." Margaret felt sick. "They're beating him." "It gets worse," Thompson continued. "Williams is talking about transferring Jake to the territorial prison for security reasons. The transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Margaret realized what this meant. Once Jake was transferred, he would be beyond their reach. Thomas's hired man could arrange an accident during the transport, and Jake would never make it to prison alive. "We have to move up our timeline," she said urgently. "Can we call an emergency council meeting for this afternoon?" "I already thought of that," Thompson said. "Dr. Patterson is gathering the council members now. We've scheduled a special session for 4 o'clock. As the afternoon approached, word spread quickly through Cedar Creek that something important was happening at the town hall. By 3:30, curious townspeople had begun gathering outside the building, sensing that drama was in the air. Margaret arrived with Thompson and Dr. Patterson, carrying her bag of evidence. She had dressed in her best remaining dress, a simple but elegant navy blue gown that made her look professional and respectable. She wanted everyone to see that she was not the broken, desperate woman who had fled town a week ago. As they entered the town hall, Margaret saw that the council chamber was packed. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. She recognized many faces from her time as a teacher, parents of her former students, shopkeepers she had dealt with, neighbors who had once been friendly. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and anticipation. Margaret knew that most of them still believed she was a thief. Today, she would have to convince them otherwise. Thomas Bradley was already seated at the head of the council table, looking calm and confident. When he saw Margaret enter, his eyes narrowed with anger, but his expression remained controlled. Sheriff Williams sat nearby, his hand resting conspicuously on his gun. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Patterson called the meeting to order. We have called this emergency session to address serious allegations of financial misconduct within our town government. A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas Bradley stood up, his face a mask of righteous indignation. Dr. Patterson, Thomas said smoothly, I object to this irregular proceeding. Miss Whitmore is a confessed thief who fled town rather than face justice. Whatever lies she's spreading now are simply an attempt to deflect attention from her own crimes. Mayor Bradley, Thompson said, rising from his seat, I think you'll find that Miss Whitmore's allegations are backed by substantial evidence. Evidence that proves you have been systematically stealing from this community for months. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Margaret could see people turning to their neighbors trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Thomas's composure slipped slightly. That's absurd. I demand to know what this so-called evidence consists of. I'm glad you asked, Margaret said, standing up with her bag of documents. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber, steady and strong despite her racing heart. Because I have quite a lot to show everyone. Margaret moved to the front of the room and began laying out documents on a table where everyone could see them. These are bank records showing transfers from various town accounts to a private account in Austin. An account controlled by Thomas Bradley. She held up the first document. This transfer of $300 from the school fund occurred on the same day that Thomas accused me of stealing that exact amount. Gasps echoed through the room. Margaret continued methodically, her teacher's training helping her present the information clearly and logically. These are forged invoices that Thomas paid to have created at a printing shop in Austin. The printer kept records showing that Thomas specifically requested that the invoices be made to look old and worn. She showed the receipt from the Austin printer. This proves that Thomas has been creating fake bills to justify withdrawing money from town accounts. This is all fabricated. Thomas shouted, jumping to his feet. Sheriff Williams, arrest this woman for spreading false accusations. But Sheriff Williams hesitated. Margaret could see uncertainty in his eyes as he looked at the evidence she was presenting. Margaret pressed her advantage. Sheriff Williams, you received a portion of the stolen money as payment for your cooperation, didn't you? Thomas has been paying you to look the other way while he robbed our community. The sheriff's face went pale. That's not... These bank records show regular payments from Thomas's private account to your personal account, Margaret said, holding up another document. The same account that received the stolen town funds. The crowd was now buzzing with angry voices. People were standing up, shouting questions, demanding answers. Margaret could see the tide of public opinion turning against Thomas. And finally, Margaret said, raising her voice over the crowd, I have this correspondence between Thomas Bradley and territorial official Patterson, discussing how to frame innocent people for their crimes. She read directly from Thomas's letter. We can pin this on the girl easily enough. She's been asking too many questions about the budget anyway. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Parents who had trusted Margaret with their children looked shocked and horrified. Mrs. Henderson, who had spat near Margaret's feet a week ago, now looked ashamed and angry at Thomas. You framed her, someone shouted from the crowd. You destroyed an innocent woman's life. Thomas was sweating now, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. These documents could be forged. Anyone could have created them. That's why I invited some special guests to today's meeting, Thompson said with satisfaction. He gestured toward the back of the room, where Margaret saw 3 men in official-looking uniforms entering the chamber. Territorial Marshal Johnson and his deputies arrived this morning after receiving my telegram, Thompson announced. They've been investigating corruption in several Texas towns, and they're very interested in what we've discovered here. Marshal Johnson was a tall, serious man with graying hair and sharp eyes. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been tracking a network of corrupt officials throughout this territory for several months. The evidence that Miss Whitmore has presented today confirms our suspicions about activities in Cedar Creek. Thomas made a sudden move toward the door. But Sheriff Williams, apparently deciding that his loyalty lay with saving himself rather than protecting Thomas, stepped forward to block his path. Thomas Bradley, Marshal Johnson said formally, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. As the deputies moved to handcuff Thomas, he turned to glare at Margaret with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done, he snarled. You think this ends here? You think you can just go back to your simple little life? Actually, Margaret said calmly. I think my life is going to be much more interesting from now on. Marshal Johnson also arrested Sheriff Williams and 2 council members who had been receiving kickbacks. As the corrupt officials were led away, the crowd began to cheer. Miss Whitmore, called out Mrs. Patterson, Lucy's mother. We owe you an apology. We should never have believed those lies. Other voices joined in, offering apologies and expressing gratitude. Margaret felt tears of relief and vindication running down her cheeks. What about Jake McAllister? Someone called out. If Miss Whitmore is innocent, then Jake probably is too. The cattle-rustling charges against Mr. McAllister will be dropped immediately, Marshal Johnson announced. Our investigation shows that the evidence against him was fabricated as part of Bradley's attempt to silence Miss Whitmore. Dr. Patterson stood up and called for order. I motion that we immediately reinstate Miss Whitmore as our schoolteacher, with a formal apology from this council, and compensation for the hardship she has endured. Seconded. Called out Henry Walsh. All in favor? Dr. Patterson asked. Every hand in the room went up. An hour later, Margaret stood outside the jail as Jake was released. He looked tired and bruised, but his eyes lit up when he saw her waiting for him. Margaret, he said softly, I knew you'd find a way. We found a way, she corrected, moving into his arms without caring who might see. We make a good team, remember? Jake held her close, and Margaret realized that she had never felt so safe or so happy in her entire life. What happens now? Jake asked. Now, Margaret said, looking up at him with a smile. We start building that future we talked about. Thompson says the town council is so grateful that they're prepared to offer a substantial reward for recovering the stolen money.